Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today we're going to answer a question that was asked by somebody in one of the comments, and that is a really important subject concerning, what you decide to do with where you live and how you pay taxes and all these kinds of things. And that is the difference between residency or legal residency and tax residency. We're also going to throw a little bit in there for you, people who wonder about domicile. I'll touch on that briefly. E-residency and a few other kind of related concepts. So stick around. This will be very important to whether you're going to get taxed or not, and possibly how you can avoid getting taxed, which is also a great thing. Before we do that, if you wouldn't mind doing something for me, I would really appreciate if you were to smash the subscribe button. Also, in order to have YouTube let you know if you want to know that there's a video coming up, which hopefully you do, click the notification bell next to it. Otherwise, you won't find out, which is terrible, terrible, terrible when people don't have that. And if you enjoy the video, click the like button. If you don't enjoy it, please tell me in the comments. If you're interested at all in these subjects, which is how to reduce your international tax or your tax period to the lowest legal net amount of tax possible, hopefully as close to zero as possible, depending on the country you're in, your situation, etc. If you're interested in asset protection, in forming offshore companies, opening offshore bank accounts, residencies in foreign countries, get second passports and citizenships, reach out to us. You can book a call with me, clarity.fm/Michael Rosmer. There's a link below in the description, or you can visit our websites, offshorecitizen.net, offshorecapitalist.com. Okay, let's head into the subject. We are talking, as I mentioned, about this pretty important distinction. And I think, the part of the importance here is that people, the words are the same, basically, that's it, right? So you will talk about residency, and usually that means, hey, where you live or how you have the right to live. I'm going to touch a little bit on kind of some nuances of that in a minute. And then you have tax residency. And these things, it's the same word, right? So let's talk about what this means. So I have another video you can check out, like what is tax residency or something like that. And I kind of go through that. Fundamentally, tax residency determines what country their tax rules apply. Okay, that's kind of the simple definition. Legal residency is where you are legally permitted to live long term, okay? And I want to kind of separate out few different things here, because you might ask, hey, listen, aren't they the same thing? Do they overlap? How do they overlap? Okay, let's cover that. So first of all, let's specify that you could have a long-term visa, which is not necessarily the same as a residency permit, which can be a little bit confusing, right? Basically, a residency permit is the idea that this is your home, you can reside there. It comes with certain privileges. Usually that means you're working towards some sort of permanent residency, some sort of citizenship, not necessarily always, but very, very often. You usually get, certain kind of availability of the services in the country, and as opposed to a visa where you're just there temporarily visiting. Now, it's bizarre because you'll have a temporary residency permit. Normally, if you have a temporary residency permit, that usually is a year to 5 years. Okay, that's kind of the range of a temporary residency permit. Permanent residency usually kicks in, beyond that, and will be, a longer term thing. Maybe it's renewed every 5 years or 10 years or, whatever, it depends. So that's residency as like a legal status. Okay, so you have the right to stay there, and you're going to get the right to certain functions of the country. Okay, tax residency very often accompanies legal residency. Okay, but not necessarily. So let's talk about some examples. Okay, if you have a golden visa in countries like Portugal, okay, we're fairly big advocates of Portugal these days, you get a residency permit, but this does not mean that you're necessarily tax resident there, okay? You might be, but you're not necessarily. Why is that? Because tax residency is usually determined by two things, or one of two things. It usually just needs to be one or the other, not both. The one is you spend at least half a year there, okay? So the so-called 183-day rule. Now, this again is a little bit deceptive because, for instance, in the US, there's something called the substantial presence test. And so it's actually a calculation that's done over 3 years. And if you average it, it's approximately 122 days a year that you can spend. You could, in theory, spend up to 6 months in any year, but it could be less than that if it's averaged over 3 years. Okay, so every country has their own numbers, but the point is that if you spend past a certain amount of time in a country, you usually become tax resident there. Okay, and by the way, this includes even if you're there on long-term visas. So for instance, I just did a video on the new digital nomad visa for Estonia, and in the case of that, you can spend all year there. You have a right to be there for a full year, but if you spend more than half a year there, you become tax resident, okay? So then basically you become taxable. Now, here's kind of the trick. The trick is that most countries, when you are a resident there, in order to maintain that residency, you are required to spend at least 6 months a year there, which means you're automatically tax resident, okay? So this is where we get into some of the visas that are maybe fairly easy to get. So for instance, you can get Slovakian pretty easily, you can get Czech fairly easily, you can get, say, Lithuanian fairly easily, you can get, I mentioned the D7 visa in Portugal, etc., okay? The problem is when you go to renew, you have to claim, hey, I spent at least 6 months out of the year here. So you could, in the first year, you can get away with all kinds of stuff. But when you go to renew, now you're saying, hey, I spent more than 6 months a year here. And at that point in time, if you're claiming, hey, I spent more than 6 months a year here, whether you did or not, right? Now you're suddenly tax resident. Now you should be paying taxes, okay? So this brings us to the second part though, because it may be that you're not spending that time, but you're still tax resident. So great example of this is sometimes you'll have someone who goes and works overseas, okay? They live and work in some different place, fantastic. And because of this, they're out of the country 9 months a year. But their home is there, their family is there, etc. So this is what we call the center of vital interests, okay? So if your center of vital interests is in a country, even though you don't spend 6 months of the year there, you may still be tax resident. So I'm in Bulgaria right now. This is a great example of this, okay? I sometimes have people come and they say, oh, you know, they're concerned because they want to get a tax residency certificate. They want to be able to claim that they're tax resident there, but they're like, I don't know how I'm going to be spending 6 months. You don't need to spend 6 months. If your home and your center of vital interest is there, you can still be tax resident, okay? So now, notice that there's a final point here that is kind of important. When you are tax resident, you are obligated to taxes there. But if you're not tax resident, you can still pay taxes there, okay? So that's, again, a little bit of a distinction. Now, every country has different measures for exactly how they figure out tax residency. Most of the time, it's what I mentioned, right? The 183 days. Pretty much you can be safe that if you're spending over 183 days in a country, you're going to be tax resident there. Usually you can be safe that if you have your center of vital interests there, you're going to be tax resident there. And so if a visa requires you to, or a residency permit requires you to spend that much time there, you're basically going to be tax resident there. Okay, so that's kind of the difference. As I mentioned, there's plenty of visas, or not plenty, but a bunch that allow you to have a residency permit, meaning you have the right to be there as much as you want, but you're not required to spend the time there. And if you're not required to spend the time there, then you aren't necessarily tax resident, okay? Golden visas being the big example. All right, let's finish off with kind of these last couple things. One is e-residency. I've mentioned this before. E-residency is not residency. This has nothing to do with these concepts at all. Forget about it. It's basically just registration with the government that allows you to do government services online quicker, okay? What about domicile? Domicile is a really confusing concept. Often domicile refers to where you're a citizen, but not necessarily. Now I bring it up because increasingly it's popular among countries like Italy and Greece to separate the concept of residency from domicile and say, hey, listen, you can be resident, non-domicile, and you're going to get treated differently than if you're resident and domiciled. We see this in Malta, right? So that's a fairly big deal. If you're a resident but non-dom, then you get treated differently. You have the same thing in UK. Historically, you have the non-dom tax plans in UK. So this has been a concept. Now, some countries, this is based on citizenship. Some it's based on, hey, have you been tax resident there the last 10 years, right? So they kind of determine that differently. It's not a very common concept, but it is one to be aware of when you're thinking about these things. Final point, of course, is that in the US, they consider if you're a citizen, you're tax resident. So, you know, that's it, you're over and done. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. It gives you a little bit of an idea. Basically, in a perfect world, you would want a residency permit in a bunch of countries that you didn't have to spend a minimum amount of time there and you weren't tax resident, and then you could be tax resident potentially nowhere, or at least tax resident in the one that is most favorable for you from a tax standpoint, and you could organize your affairs accordingly. So I'm a big fan of this. I think that it's fantastic when you can do that. You know, say having a Schengen visa that gives you access to all the Schengen zone, you can maybe be working towards a passport, without actually being there and paying tax. Anyway, hope that helps. If you enjoyed this video, again, please smash the subscribe button for sure, and the notification bell. Always hit the notification bell. Hit the like button, and like I said, I would love to hear from you. Put any comments you have below, any feedback you've got, and if you're interested at all in these subjects, if you'd like help with them, please reach out to us, clarity.fm/Michael Rosmer. You can book a call. It's link is in the description below, or visit our website. It's offshorecitizen.net, offshorecapitalist.com. I'm going to see you guys on the next video.